Tom Izu is the immediate past executive director of the California History Center at Anza College, where for 24 years he directed its work in promoting local, regional, and state history through publications, exhibits, oral history projects, and courses, and the operation of a research library and archives. During his tenure with the center, he launched a civil liberties project inspired by the lessons learned from the World War II experience of Japanese Americans, and he continues to serve as on its board as an advisor. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, helping to lead various grant-funded projects with a special focus on public programming that connects the community's experience with other communities of color, especially in regards to cultural and civil liberties concerns. One such project for which he's a co-director is an augmented reality community art project, The Hidden Histories of San Jose, Japantown. It explores the stories of the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino American communities and their overlapping histories and connections in the making of modern day Japantown. So without further ado, I welcome Tom Izu, who will be sharing with us tonight.
I'm sorry, excuse me, my voice is, every time in fall, I have these bad allergies. So if you hear me clearing my throat, I'm not sick as far as I know. So thank you very much, Erica. I really love the theme of your discussion tonight, and it's a real privilege to be here. So my presentation this afternoon is entitled Exploring a Sense of Place, Community, and Identity Building Through Local History and Augmented Reality Art. Is based upon my experience creating a very specific project I worked on, The Hidden Histories of San Jose, Japantown, which is place-based, grassroots in nature, and operated under the auspices of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, pictured here in the slide. Augmented reality is an app that allows you to see images and hear sounds while looking through your smartphone's camera view. Think of it as Pokemon Go, but in this case with art and history added to it. And the place I'm going to focus on is San Jose, Japantown. Many of you might know this place already. Located near downtown San Jose, this neighborhood-based community is quite small in size, but has a long history and a bustling cultural life with restaurants, churches, small businesses, and all sorts of lively annual festivals. Its history goes back to the immigration of Japanese agricultural laborers during the late 1800s and early 1900s, who came to work the orchards and fields of Santa Clara Valley. Nihonmachi, or Japantown, was a place for those workers and farmers to get needed services and socialize in what was otherwise a very hostile environment for Asian immigrants. Next slide, please. For me, this place has a very special meaning and was key in the development of my identity as a Japanese American. Some personal background here. In the early 1960s, I grew up in a predominantly white area of Sunnyvale, where few Asians or any people of color lived. During my childhood, no one explained to me what had happened to my grandparents and parents during World War II when they were expelled from California and moved into concentration camps. Nor did I get any help in understanding why in school and in the neighborhood I was called a Jap, a Gook, or a Chink, with kids making fun of what I ate and even how I looked. Suffice to say that I grew up feeling very alienated and not knowing who I really was or whether I would ever fit in anywhere. When I got to go to college in the 1970s, my older brothers encouraged me to become involved in the burgeoning Asian American student movement and to be part of the effort to fight for ethnic studies. Through this experience, I learned how some of my peers, mostly Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino American students at the time, were working with their elders to create programs and services to help their communities. And this is what I ended up doing. I returned to San Jose area and went to Japantown, where my grandparents had lived, and immersed myself in the community, working for service programs, including one that cared for the needs of Japanese American elders. Next slide, please. But as I did this work, I began to discover that this place wasn't just about Japanese Americans, but was a place with a shared history with many other communities, most notably Chinese and Filipino Americans. As I listened to the stories from my elders, walked around my newly adopted neighborhood, I started to see that the place I thought I knew, a symbol of my Japanese Americanness, was actually much more than that. I started to see evidence of something much bigger, older, and complicated. This was really a place that AAPIs of these three communities created an actual Asian American community. Although the trajectories of these three groups weren't completely historically synchronized, with one group's presence going down while another went up, or when big gaps appeared in the shared experiences. For example, when one part of the neighborhood was literally turned into a ghost town during World War II by the forced removal and imprisonment of Japanese Americans into internment camps. But these overlapping histories and interconnections across cultures nevertheless produced a rich legacy of shared stories and experiences I had never heard about before, hidden from view and generally unexplored. Some background. The reason why Japantown existed was because Chinatown was there first. Its inhabitants had escaped the wrath of white supremacists who in 1887 burned down their original Chinatown located where the Fairmont Hotel exists today in downtown San Jose. And they founded a new Chinatown where current day Japantown is now located, called Heinleinville. As immigration from China was shut down due to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Chinese laborers were recruited to take their place in the fields, and a Japantown began to form around the existing Chinatown. The Japanese were not welcome elsewhere, and the Chinese businesses were the only ones that would extend credit to them, so they were drawn to Heinleinville. And in 1930, a bustling Filipino community we now call Pinoy Town flourished next to Heinleinville, Chinatown, and Japantown. This was fueled by the increase in the number of Filipinos recruited to take the place of Japanese immigrants when immigration from Japan was cut back by the 1924 Immigration Act, and a new agricultural labor force was needed. As with the Japanese, Filipinos could find a space here for businesses and needed socialization that was not possible anywhere else in the city due to the intense racism against all Asians then. Next slide, please. I began to wonder, why did these three groups come together in this one neighborhood area when I knew that the relationship between these immigrants' homelands was problematic to say the least? During most of this time period I'm talking about, Japan was either invading or brutally occupying parts of China and the Philippines. As I brought in my inquiry, I found out that these three communities did not coexist just because some sort of stereotypical cultural affinity. It was because these different immigrant groups were not welcome to set up businesses in downtown San Jose and were relegated to what was then the outskirts of the city center. Political movements fueled by white supremacists of the day had created a deeply segregated city and predetermined where different groups could set up shop in the city. In illustrating this point, in the 1930s, a federally sponsored program was created to rationalize how and to whom loans and investments were made in different neighborhoods throughout the country. This produced what are now known as redlining maps. These maps unwittingly document the existence of segregation throughout the nation. In San Jose, de facto segregation, that is created not by law but by local practice, was captured in this 1937 map. The red area you see contains what is now known as Japantown, as well as a historic Black neighborhood nearby. The high concentration of Orientals and Negroes, to use the language of the report that accompanies the map, made for what they determined to be a hazardous situation for investments and loan giving. This is a graphic illustration of one aspect of the trilogy of experiences many AAPI immigrant communities have historically shared: exclusion, expulsion, and segregation. As I was later to understand, the possibility of coexistence in this one neighborhood came to be because members of these three AAPI groups somehow figured out a way to get along, provide mutual aid, and share the neighborhood because they felt that this was the best way to get by during this exclusionary time period. Next slide, please. I was beginning to see this place as a sort of living history lab that could help broaden AAPI students and community members' understanding of their own histories and the identities they had here in San Jose, and how they were impacted by the same social and political and historical forces and what they did in response. I could try to bring this nuanced history out by using this one location. This led to the founding of the Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown project I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Next slide, please. The Hidden Histories project had advisors to help artists we selected from the community to understand the history of Japantown area on a local, experiential scale, passing on important concepts as well as personal stories. And I'm going to share some of them really briefly here. Connie Youngyu, a historian and author, her grandfather owned a shop in Heinleinville, Chinatown, told our artist the story of the basket. When she was a little girl visiting her grandmother in her neighborhood, her grandmother told her how she used to pass a basket over a fence back and forth between herself and a Japanese neighbor, with a grandmother sharing Chinese vegetables she grew in her backyard, and in turn receiving blocks of tofu from the neighbor in exchange. Other things went back and forth throughout their relationship. Although Connie was quite young at the time, she did know that during the same time period, Japan and China were at war, and she asked her grandmother about that. What grandmother told her was this: that was over there. Here, all that matters is that we were neighbors and we had to care for each other. Steve Fujita, a Japanese American, another one of our advisors, who is an emeritus professor of psychology and ethnic studies, Santa Clara University, was born in one of the internment camps and grew up in Cleveland during the war. He shared a story about when he arrived to San Jose and visited Japantown, he immediately felt that it was like a sanctuary for himself. And he felt comfortable and he felt like he could fit in. And he imagined this is exactly the same way the first Japanese immigrants felt. And he shared with the artist that this emotional feeling he had even to this day, especially with the pandemic and the rise of anti-Asian hate, made this place feel like a sanctuary. Filipino-American Robert Raxap, who grew up in Japantown neighborhood, shared many stories of his childhood during the 1930s about his exploits of his friends, who are mainly Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese kids. He could create images in our artists' minds of himself as a child with young buddies running noisily through the streets of Japantown and getting chased out the many places we now consider to be of historic significance, including the temple in Heinleinville, the film theater in Japantown area, and also the Filipino pool hall, which was very famous and was a card room and hangout, which did not appreciate he and his friends' underage presence. Next slide, please. So these stories helped our artists understand the emotions behind the history we had them learn about, and to successfully design narratives for the augmented reality art pieces they were asked to create. Many of them were quite young, having just graduated from San Jose State's Digital Media Arts program, but some of them were also seasoned community artists who had no technical skills, but together they developed a sense of community and a sense of camaraderie that helped them to make this physical space and use it as a canvas for bringing to life the stories and histories they were learning about. Next slide, please. So this project ended up creating 9 different augmented reality creations spread out through Japantown neighborhood. And it created a very immersive experience using technology, local history, and storytelling to capture a sense of place and to create kind of an open air and history gallery. It invited the people look at the neighborhood that they might be visiting in a very different way than they usually do when they're just shopping and walking around. Next slide, please. This is an example of the augmented reality artwork. This is called Winds of Change, and it uses digitized photos, posters, protest buttons, and other things to bring out a little known history of the neighborhood that during the 1960s through the 1980s, many AAPI youth centering their work in Japantown actually helped create things that people take for granted today now, including organizations such as the Asian Law Alliance, UI Kai Senior Center, where I had worked, and the San Jose Taiko Group, to name a few. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk about these resources. I believe they're being passed out to you already, but there's a number of different things that you can look at to learn more about the project and some of our views about it. On the next slide. This is my contact information, and I can also put it in the chat. And I think I'm over time, but I believe that they're also going to be shared with you some of my takeaways for why I think doing place-based work in history and local history is so important for education. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking more with all of you and with our other guest speakers.